Above the white stone of the house, a light trembled, but it did not come from the sun. From the cracks in the walls seeped a golden glow, and within it, like in deep water, a figure with pierced hands slowly emerged. Below, in the basement, the walls whispered a name no one dared to speak. Her childhood had unfolded behind walls so high they seemed to hold back not only the desert wind, but the world itself. The white stone of the outer facade gleamed in the morning sun, absorbing and releasing the heat in long, slow breaths. Inside, polished marble floors caught fragments of the sky, soft clouds drifting across their cold surfaces, as if the heavens had been laid beneath her feet. Servants moved without sound, their steps vanishing into carpets the color of sand at dusk. Shadows from the intricate latticework played across the vaulted ceilings, changing shape with the passing of the day, as though the house itself was alive and breathing. She learned to move through these spaces with the same precision as the servants. Measured steps, a lowered gaze, a stillness in the hands. From an early age, she had been taught the correct words, the correct gestures, the correct prayers, each one repeated until it became part of her muscle memory. Her name carried both softness and weight, the kind of name that opened doors in private halls and made people stand straighter when they heard it. She was the daughter of a man whose signature could alter lives, whose decisions reached far beyond the boundaries of the house. The air inside always carried layers of scent. The deep, resinous smoke of agar wood curling from brass burners, the faint bitterness of coffee boiled with sugar until it was almost syrup, the dryness of stone cooled by the night air. Every morning began with the same certainty, the certainty of adults who believed the world's order was fixed and eternal, the certainty that obedience sustained that order, that fear was the root of faith, and that honor was measured in silence. At night, when the hum of the air conditioners filled the hallways with a steady artificial wind, she would lie awake and listen to the clock slicing the darkness into identical fragments. The sound was metronomic, unchanging, yet it made the night feel longer, stretching endlessly ahead. From beyond the walls, the distant calls of the muezzins reached her in overlapping waves, merging into one continuous layer, like sand blown across the surface of the desert. Somewhere deep inside her chest, between her ribs, there was a fine fracture, a barely audible crack that appeared whenever the words she spoke and the life she lived passed each other without meeting. She noticed the forbidden books that appeared only in whispers, bound in cloth and hidden from sight. She noticed the way people's eyes could betray them, revealing thoughts in the smallest flicker of movement. She began to practice the discipline of lowering her gaze, not out of shyness, but to protect the quiet, unspoken part of herself. Even as a child, she understood that within those high walls, everything had its place, every word its consequence, and every glance its price. The white stone reflected the sun by day and held the night like a sealed jar, but it could not contain the slow, almost invisible shifting that had already begun inside her. Her youth unfolded with the same deliberate rhythm as a ceremonial procession. Every step, every word, every gesture was measured, contained, and predictable. The walls around her, once seamless and impenetrable, had always filtered the world, admitting only what was sanctioned. But one day, almost imperceptibly, they began to let through something else, slivers of light that did not belong to the palace lamps or the burning sky outside. It began in secret, under the weight of blankets at night, when the household had surrendered to sleep. The faint glow of a small screen cast shadows across her face as she scrolled through stories she was never meant to read or hear. They came from far-off places, from people whose eyes reflected a freedom she had been told did not exist. These voices spoke without demands, without threats, without the cadence of orders she had known since childhood. They extended an invitation rather than an ultimatum, offering something that felt both impossibly distant and startlingly near. She did not resist these words. She allowed them to fall into her as rain falls on thirsty soil, soaking into cracks she had not realized were there. Her dreams began to change. They grew denser, more vivid, stitched together with details too sharp to dismiss as fleeting visions. She found herself in a garden she did not recognize, yet somehow knew, a place where the air was warm and clean, and the light seemed to have weight. Figures clothed in white moved gently among the trees, their garments whispering as they passed. The leaves shimmered with a sound like fine metal struck softly, and each step on the grass left no shadow behind. In these dreams there was no fear, no edge of threat, only the enveloping warmth she remembered from her mother's embrace in the earliest years of her life. The days remained unchanged on the surface. She still walked through vast rooms where chandeliers spilled patterned light across marble and gold. She still lowered her head to receive blessings from men who carried both faith and power like a single inseparable garment. Their hands were steady, their words practiced, their authority unquestionable. Yet she no longer felt entirely within their grasp. At night, her heart began to rehearse a name it had never been allowed to speak aloud. Each whisper shaped the contours of something new inside her, a silence that did not resemble submission, but rather a stillness filled with quiet strength. It bloomed in the hidden corners of her mind, expanding until it seemed to press against the very walls that had always surrounded her. The more she let the name rise within her, the more the air itself seemed to change, carrying traces of a light she could not see but could feel with absolute certainty. The walls had not yet cracked, but they no longer felt complete. Something was passing through them, unnoticed by all but her. It came like a signal, faint yet undeniable, carrying the promise of a place where silence was not imposed by fear, but chosen in peace. And though she moved through her days as before, her nights belonged entirely to this light, and to the quiet pulse it left within her. The world she inhabited had been built from rules and the weight of watching eyes, its structure perfected over generations to leave no room for deviation. In such a world, the smallest fracture was noticed, the faintest ripple disturbed the surface. The house knew when someone stopped being its reflection. It did not happen all at once. At first, there were only subtle departures. The slow drifting of her gaze away from the prescribed texts, the occasional refusal to take part in customary rituals, the barely perceptible pauses that crept between her words. These gestures were too small to name, yet they registered somewhere deep in the order of the place, like an almost inaudible change in a clock's ticking. Gradually, the geometry of the house seemed to shift. Corners sharpened, angles grew more severe. The air itself became more attentive, carrying a faint, unspoken scrutiny. Those accustomed to her quiet compliance began to notice breaths that did not fit the rhythm, silences that were not the same as before. It was as though the walls had learned to listen more closely, and the space between them had grown tighter. Her faith, still fragile and untested, soon met the thing that, in her city, was called honor. It did not wear the face of courage or integrity. It wore the scent of official paper, the gloss of red wax seals, the chill of orders spoken into telephones. Honor here was administrative, procedural, without warmth. It was something enforced rather than lived. Her life, once wrapped in the muted glow of half-shadow, was abruptly drawn into an unforgiving light. The curtains that once softened the sun and cast intricate patterns across the floor were pulled shut and fastened with hooks, not to keep the heat out, but to keep something in. Doors, once opened with a gentle push, now resisted her touch, as if their weight had doubled overnight. The home that had raised her shed its gentler disguises and revealed its machinery, cold, deliberate, mechanical. Somewhere inside it, invisible gears had locked into place, and the process of correction had begun. This was not a process that allowed for hesitation or tenderness. It was exact, well-practiced, and without pity. She clung to the fragile life that had begun to form within her, holding fast to its images. The garden from her dreams where the air was warm and unthreatening, the steady gaze in which there had been no contempt, the single word that carried no danger in its sound. These became her anchor points, the small markers that reminded her she was still herself. She whispered that word in the hours when the walls seemed to press closer, her voice barely louder than a breath. It was not defiance that kept her speaking it, but preservation, the need to hold on to the last space the house could not reach. Inside, she guarded a silence that was no longer the product of fear, but a deliberate choice, a stillness she fought to protect. It was the one freedom that could not be seized unless she surrendered it, the quiet consent to remain herself, even as the world around her tried to reforge her into its mirror. The walls might have been closing in, but behind them something within her had already decided it would not break. In every great house, there was always a staircase that the family never used, the kind that did not appear on the grand tours given to guests. It was narrow, utilitarian, meant for the quiet movement of those who served and those who carried burdens unseen. This one was painted a dull black, the color of iron, long exposed to darkness, its edges worn smooth by countless unremarked footsteps. It began in a shadowed corner of the ground floor, away from the polished halls and perfumed rooms, descending steeply into the deep belly of the building. The air there was cooler, heavier, holding the faint scent of metal and something faintly chemical, like cleaning agents that never touched the upper floors. When she stepped onto the first stair, there were no witnesses. The corridor above closed itself off behind her, the light narrowing until it was gone entirely. The only company she had were the walls, painted the same dark tone as the steps, absorbing rather than reflecting any light that dared to follow her down. Somewhere far below, the constant hum of the air conditioning shifted in tone, deepening into a muted mechanical roar, as though the house itself had a heartbeat hidden in its depths. The sound grew stronger with each step she took. The staircase turned sharply after a dozen steps, then again, winding downward in a way that made it impossible to see the bottom. There were no windows, no openings to break the descent. The air cooled further until each inhalation felt like drawing in a breath from a metal surface chilled by night. Her hand slid along the wall for balance, and the paint was smooth but cold, carrying a lifeless texture that seemed to deny any trace of human warmth. At the bottom of the final turn, the stairs gave way to a long, low corridor lined with unmarked doors. Here, the light was dim and unyielding, fluorescent strips that hummed faintly overhead, their glow neither warm nor comforting, but clinical, as if their only purpose was to measure what they illuminated. The corridor swallowed sound, muffling her footsteps until they felt disconnected from her body. There was no sense of the time of day down here. The air had the sterile dryness of spaces that never breathed fresh air. The first room she entered had no windows. None of them did. These were spaces designed to strip away the world outside and leave only what was inside the walls and inside her. The walls themselves were plain, but there was an exactness to their lines, a geometry that suggested careful measurement and deliberate intent. There was no softness anywhere, no curtains, no furniture that offered comfort, no shadows deep enough to hide in. The light did not warm, it evaluated. Here, words like mercy dissolved into nothing, replaced by an inventory of methods and tools. Instruments were laid out with precise order, as if they had been catalogued and checked against a list. In this place, prayer was no longer a cry from the soul, but a set of instructions, a ritual stripped of faith and repurposed as discipline. The language of this world was procedural, its grammar built on command and compliance. Time moved differently here. She counted its passage not by clocks, but by the rhythmic cycle of sensations. Her body kept a separate count from her mind. The skin learned its own ledger, recording the number and weight of impacts, the pressure of restraint, the exact intervals between each wave of force. These records would outlast conscious memory. In moments like this, the human self fractured into fragments. Here was pain, raw and immediate. There was a memory of a child's laughter, so fragile it could barely hold against the present. And, in between, flashes of visions, brief and brilliant, like sunlight trembling on the surface of morning water. No questions were asked. Questions implied recognition, and recognition implied the existence of a person to be addressed. Here, there was no person, only the process, and the process acknowledged no individuality. The true subject here was order, signed and sealed in the language of decrees, given authority by the weight of signatures and the permanence of official stamps. The will of this place moved without hesitation. The building itself conspired with the process. Concrete ceilings absorbed sound until even the sharpest cries dissolved into a dense silence. That silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the knowledge of countless moments that had been swallowed before. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the skin as much as the air. In this environment, loyalty was not spoken. It was measured in the stillness of those who knew and turned their faces away. And yet, under the noise and the counting, beneath the ache that wrapped around her like a second skin, there was something else. It was faint, like the thinnest thread of music drifting into a room from far away. It was the echo of words she had read at night, the quiet promise she had heard in the garden of her dreams, the memory of a gaze that did not judge. These were not illusions. They were intrusions from another world, small but unyielding. They did not make the pain vanish, but they held her together, preventing her from dissolving entirely into the machinery of this place. Her breathing became shallower, each inhalation a careful step along a narrow ledge. There was no rhythm to it now, only the stubborn continuation of movement, as if every breath was a choice to remain. The air she drew in was cold, sharp, and metallic, but within each breath there was a quiet affirmation, a steady yes to the thing she had already chosen. The yes did not weaken with the hours. It became the only unbroken thing she carried. In this underground heart of the house, where the walls were indifferent and the light was without warmth, she did not win or lose. She simply endured, and in the endurance there was a form of resistance the walls could not measure. The black staircase had delivered her into the depths, but it could not dictate what she kept alive within herself. That remained hers alone. In houses like this, death was never permitted to arrive as chaos. It was arranged, scheduled, and filed. The first steps were always administrative. Papers were drafted with precision, their language dry and without texture, stripped of any human resonance. Nowhere did the words strike, cry, or guilt appear. Instead, the documents carried neutral phrasing, the kind that could pass through a dozen offices without raising a question. They named causes in the language of inevitability, authenticated them with signatures that bore no tremor, and stamped them with dates that made events seem like they had always been intended. The act of writing these papers transformed something raw and irreversible into a closed matter, tucked into a folder, its violence replaced with the antiseptic smell of bureaucracy. The carpets were lifted in silence, their folds concealing what had been. In the courtyard, gravel shifted softly under careful steps, releasing a breath of stone and dust. Vehicles arrived and departed with a choreography of muffled tires, their movements designed to avoid drawing the attention of anyone who might be watching from behind a curtain. Even the air seemed to adjust, thickening to absorb stray sounds. On the surface, nothing was happening. And yet, everything had already happened. Beyond the gates, the city continued with its rehearsed life. In the cool interiors of shopping centers, fountains cast water upward in precise arcs. the droplets catching the light as if they might pull a forgotten sky down into their basins. Evening avenues glowed with the heat of headlights, their reflections stretching like molten lines across windshields. In covered squares, prayers rose in measured unison, their cadences practiced and beautiful, flowing like fabric that had been woven for centuries. Those who knew kept their eyes fixed on the glass of their phones, absorbing the light without revealing thought. Those who did not know lingered in the warmth of the air, tasting their coffee and speaking of small, safe things. Inside the house, the lower rooms were open to air. The walls exhaled a faint chill as the heavy scent of sealed concrete drifted upward. On the black staircase, the marks of 3 steps were wiped away. Cloth and water worked over the surface until the gray returned to its ordinary, unremarkable tone. The smell became simply the smell of stone, stripped of its recent history, but there were things that could not be catalogued or erased. No page could hold them, no official stamp could freeze them into an archive. They were shadows that refused to be pinned in place. In certain corners of the house, the air retained a trace of residual warmth, as if the shape of her presence had been pressed into it. On the junction where 2 corridors met, a servant might pause without knowing why, her hand tightening around a tray, her heartbeat missing one measure before continuing. The sensation passed, but it left behind a faint, unplaceable awareness, like a word remembered in a language not spoken aloud. In the garden, beneath the thickest canopy of leaves, a faint ringing could still be heard at certain hours. It was not loud, not even constant, more like the delicate tremor of a fingertip brushing the rim of a vessel filled with light. The sound was too fine to disturb the air, too thin to be caught by devices or recorded on a chart. Yet it persisted, steady and untouchable. Not everyone could hear it. Those who did often kept the knowledge to themselves. They did not speak of it at first, uncertain whether it was a trick of the senses or something meant only for them. But with time, a change came over them. They began to look upward more often, their eyes lingering on the pale mornings when the sky seemed to empty itself of every impurity. On those days, the blue was almost translucent, stripped to a clarity that felt like the opening of an unwritten page. The page was not theirs to write, nor could it be held in their hands. Still, something in its untouched expanse made them stand longer by windows, their gazes fixed on that fragile brightness. They did not name what they felt. They simply carried it quietly, like a folded note in a pocket that they dared not open but could never throw away. And though the house resumed its routines, sealing its doors and setting its guards, that note, unread, unrecorded, remained in the air, unclaimed by anyone yet present for those willing to notice. It was in this unspoken space, in the gap between the official record and the living world, that her absence began to work. Not as a disruption, but as a slow, invisible rearrangement. Not as a ghost, but as a shadow that could not be pressed flat. Stories of violence preferred silence, but silence was never the only language. There was the language of traces left on water, the language of glances that shifted when they should have stayed still, the language of kindness offered in places where kindness had no reason to exist. In the city where everything was regulated, memory obeyed no regulations. It moved in hidden channels, slipping through places no law could reach, flowing like water beneath locked streets. Her name was never spoken openly, but another phrase took its place: the girl who chose. It was enough. The words traveled quietly, lodging themselves in the minds of those who had grown tired of fear, and in their chests they felt the forming of a small, warm knot, the same knot that had once grown inside her. Her death never reached the headlines. It became something else, a fracture, and in fractures, light could enter. It did not come to dismantle or to reorder. It simply revealed what had always been there. Dust, invisible until that moment, floated in the air, lit into clarity. People began to notice small things. How their own homes sometimes exhaled the cold of unseen basements. How unexpected warmth would appear in rooms that had no reason to be warm. Someone discovered an old book, downloaded in secret one night, and did not delete it. Someone else, ascending a black staircase in another building, listened to the silence more carefully and realized that it was not empty at all. Light passed through stone, not because stone was weak, but because light was patient. It did not argue with the laws of the world. It remained unyielding and present until its presence became undeniable. In her memory, no statues were built. Instead, a shift occurred in the way people looked. The cautious must that had lived beneath their eyelashes faded, replaced by a firm is. There was another kind of air now. There was another kind of silence. There was a name that could not be traded. There was a garden where the leaves rang gently every morning when the wind touched them. Her life had been swallowed by the mechanism, but it had not vanished. It became what reports could never contain, an inner freedom for those who still breathed, a quiet hope for those who could no longer speak. Her path had been shorter than it should have been, yet it was not barren. It became a marker on the road, small and easily overlooked, but stubborn in its presence, pointing the way for anyone who might one day wake in a cold room and recognize that the yes within them had already been born, and could not be betrayed, even if the house around them turned into a machine. The end of her story came without spectacle, but it was irreversible. In the first light of morning, when the white stone walls caught the sky again, there was sometimes a brief moment when the surface seemed to tremble, as if something alive had passed through its depth. It was not wind, nor the shift of heat. It was the breath of spirit moving through the weight of the world, and no thickness of stone could forbid it. In that trembling lived the memory of the girl, with the fracture between her ribs, the woman who said yes to the light, and the city that would spend years learning how to speak silence not as fear, but as freedom. The light did not demand recognition. It passed quietly, settling into the smallest places, waiting for the moment someone might see it. And once seen, it was impossible to unsee. In this way, her presence outlived her absence, threading itself through the spaces between walls and the pauses between words. It did not need to be named to exist. It moved as she once had, through corridors, through gardens, through locked gates, carrying with it the truth that stone could never truly hold back what had already chosen to pass through. Even in the city's most ordered districts, where routines ran with the precision of clockwork, the light found its way into cracks too small to measure. It brushed across the hands of strangers, lingered in the breath between two heartbeats, and settled in the memory of a place no one had ever written down. It was not a monument and not a prayer. It was simply the continuation of what she had carried. And in that continuation, the stone itself, for all its weight, seemed lighter,